Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz Haider. Today I'm going to talk about a book. The title is Geopolitical Conflict in the Wolf World, Great Power Competition and the Illiberal Revolt against the Liberal Order. This book has been published by Bloomsbury Academic and was recently launched in Pakistan by Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is a German foundation. I will be discussing it with the author, Marc Saxer. But before I get to the discussion and introduce Marc, a word about this program. It is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. Now, let's get to the author, who's also a friend. Marc Saxer is a political analyst, strategist, and writer with 2 decades of experience in international affairs. He's based in Bangkok, where he convenes the Asia Strategic Foresight Group. His work on transformation, democratization, geopolitics, and geoeconomics has been translated into more than 20 languages and featured in major international media outlets. His previous book, Transformative Realism: How to Overcome the Systemic Crisis, was published in 2022. But before we open the discussion with Marc, let me just lay down some of the points that he makes in the book. So the first point is that the wolf world is here, and it's not a metaphor. So what does he mean by that? Basically, it opens with Thomas Hobbes's Homo homini lupus est, which is actually from Plautus, but was quoted by Hobbes in Leviathan in 1651. And it's basically, it means man is a wolf to man. Now, the post-Cold War liberal order, says Marc, is dead. Essentially, Pax Americana is over. We are entering an era where might makes right. Great powers carve off spheres of influence, and the law of the jungle replaces the rule of law. And this is not a warning, he says, it's a diagnosis. Then the liberal order collapsed from within and without. So it's a double whammy. The illiberal revolt is real, and it comes from left, right, and big tech. Then Marc says that there are 3 theaters. One, overstretched superpower. So geopolitically, these 3 primary conflict zones: Europe, where Russia is facing off NATO; the Middle East, where Iran was aggressed against by Israel. Gulf states are party to that conflict in favor of the United States and Israel. And East Asia, where you have the peer competition between the United States, the existing superpower, and China, which is the rising superpower. And says Marc, the US can no longer fight 2 wars, let alone 3. And this overstretch is not temporary. Retrenchment is structural and changes everything for allies like Europe and Japan. Geoeconomics is the new battlefield. I must make this point because in Pakistan, we've been using this term in a Lockean sense: cooperation, cooperative geoeconomics. But in the West, where it emerged as a neologism by Edward Luttwak, it was meant to the economic and trade and financial toolkit was to be used coercively in favor of and in support of geopolitics. There is no single victor, so there is asymmetrical multipolarity. Civilizations bring different visions of order. And so how is this going to pan out? And this is where Marc kind of is very courageous. He wades into the unknown. So there are 3 possible orders and 1 realistic path. So you could have a concert of powers with spheres of influence, which is favored by Russia and the Trumpian realists. You could have a Westphalian order of equal sovereign states favored by the global South, and a rules-based, what I would call the international law-based multipolar order with thin institutionalization, which is Marc's preferred path. And so he talks about a Helsinki 2.0. We'll get to Helsinki. It was 1975, Cold War. And, there was this whole sense of somehow you got to get a balance and do something. And there were the Helsinki Accords. And so Marx says that Helsinki 2.0 is important. You got to have something like that. And then he says Europe must wake up or get eaten. So according to him, Europe is the most vulnerable player. It depended on the US security, Russian energy, and Chinese exports, all poof, gone. And he calls for strategic autonomy, territorial defense, neighborhood stabilization, economic renewal, and a pragmatic foreign policy that stops moralizing and starts balancing. It's more or less the kind of thing, and Mark wrote this before Mark Carney came to Davos and talked about it, that, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. Then, of course, liberalism must change or die. So the final theme is pretty philosophical. Now, Mark is not anti-liberal. He's anti-neoliberal and anti-progressive neoliberal. That's my reading. And that's what we're going to discuss. And he argues that liberalism can survive only if it abandons missionary universalism, rebuilds material solidarity with working and middle classes, and accepts a thinner, more realist rules-based order. Otherwise, the illiberal wolves will keep winning. So that's broadly, I've described a very complex book, by the way. And so I'm not saying that what I've said is the book. The viewers, whoever can get hold of the book, will have to read it themselves in order to actually get the full flavor of it. But I also wanted to, essentially, this is like a teaser, to discuss it with Mark and to see where things stand. So, Mark, great to have you back this time virtually. You were physically in Pakistan, and I had the pleasure and the honor of speaking at your one of your book launches. So, you saying American hegemony is gone, and because American hegemony is gone, now we have entered the wolf world. So my first question to you is, and this question is, I posit this because there is a general sense that perhaps this is not structural, that it is because of the advent into the White House of one Mr. Donald Trump. But your book is very clear on the structural reasons for why we have entered the wolf world. So let's begin there.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. We saw each other last week in Lahore. I stayed on a little bit longer in Islamabad and had the full pleasure of discussing with a lot of brilliant minds. You're obviously one of them, so you summed up the book so good that I'm not exactly sure what I could add to it. Thank you very much. But I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Think you really addressing a very, very important point that literally comes up every time I have this kind of discussion. Actually, more in the West, to be honest, because there is, especially for the Europeans, there is some hope that if there's going to be a new president in the White House, this nightmare, when it is a nightmare for Europe, is going to end. I think otherwise, as you already hinted, this is a structural overstretch. It started before Trump and it will continue well after Trump is gone. There are several reasons for that. I would say there is a military dimension. I think you already allured to that. We do have at a minimum 3 primary theaters of geopolitical conflict. Where US hegemony is challenged, Russia in Europe, Iran in the Middle East and Asia. In East Asia, it is China. 2 of these theaters are already hot with the wars in Iran and Ukraine, and Taiwan and all the other potential conflict zones are still dangerous. I hope it will not escalate. So the military overstretch has to do with the fact that the US can no longer, and that was until recently the official national defense strategy of the United States, to be able to fight 2 or 3 simultaneous wars and win them. Now it looks like they cannot even win one of them, let alone three simultaneously. So I think you already can see very clearly now, after the Iran attacks, that the US can no longer support the other theaters, Ukraine and Taiwan, on the level that maybe some in the US, not so sure about the government right now, would want to, right? So the military stretch is very real. You see that from Asia, they have pulled parts of their fleet from the South China Sea. They have pulled part of their missile defense from the Korean Peninsula. They pulled troops from Japan. There have been a delay or a cancellation of troop deployments in Europe. So these are real things. This is not just some analyst talking. This is actually happening, and that's the military overstretch. The second one may even more severe. That's the financial overstretch. The US ticks right now, I think that's 2025, 37 trillion US dollars in debt. That is the federal debt. Actually, there is more if you look at the rest of the society. Counting, right? Trump has announced to actually increase the military budget by 50% to the clock of 1.5 trillion US dollars per year. The US has been downgraded by a couple of the top rating institutions from its AAA rating. I think one cannot overestimate what that means. The US is being the anchor of the global financial system. It's been the safe haven, actually, for every crisis that we've seen in the last 80 years. It is providing the reserve currency. It's providing the guiding currency for global trade. And you see this crisis, that there have been movements out of the US treasuries. There's been questions about the fiscal sustainability of the US. Early days when it comes to that, but I think you can see that there is also a financial overstretch, in particular, to this. And finally, there is, I think, a domestic political overstretch. That's your whole MAGA. It's not just MAGA. If you look at, for instance, the issue of trade, global free trade, there's almost like a consensus from the progressive to the right that the US does not benefit from free trade. You see, of course, when it comes to the question of offshoring, outsourcing, complex global supply chains, there is also almost a consensus that this has hurt the American working class and middle classes. And on the right, of course, you have the MAGA movement, which is basically saying America first means, and I think that there's this quote that I really like, globalism means to sacrifice the nation on behalf of the empire. America first means to dismantle the empire in order to save the nation. Now, this is a grassroots movement. You see that the current Trump government is ignoring its own roots. Let's see how that plays out by the midterms. But these things are not going to go away. There is an enormous fatigue with the forever wars. There is an enormous fatigue with the cost of empire in the US. So that's like the third factor. I think that's not going to go away. Military, financial, domestic, political overstretch in a global world that is increasingly multipolar, and the US is challenged by great powers. So I do believe this is structural. It preceded Trump, and it will outlast Trump.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the more philosophical parts of your book, but since we're talking about conflicts, two other issues stand out. One, of course, is geoeconomics as the new battlefield, as I said in my opening. Wars, especially nuclear wars, are risky, so you fight through trade, tech, and finance. And so you have the industrial policies that are back. Protectionism is now becoming the norm. Supply chains are being weaponized. And we know that the US is using tariffs and dollar dominance to bully allies and rivals alike. And China and the BRICS nations and the SCO nations, they're building alternate payment systems and tech ecosystems. So the liberal economic order is over. I want you to flag for me what this actually means. The whole idea of friendshoring and reshoring and the rest of it, you talked about it during the book launch. So that's one point. And the other point is about not having a single victor. So China and the US, they are obviously the superpowers, but neither can fully dominate each other. But at the same time, you've got regional powers like we've just seen with Iran, which fought a different kind of war altogether and has basically stopped the US military might in its tracks. So these 2 points I want you to discuss before we move on to the more civilizational questions and the idea of why liberalism is dead or dying.
Well, these are like huge questions, right? I try my
Yeah, I
best.
know. I mean, which is why I said that essentially the reader has to read the book because you
Yes.
you you detail them,
Yeah.
more sort of, point to the nuances and complexities.
Right. So let's start with the geoeconomics. Of course, if you look at this thing, and I do know that you hail from Pakistan, from the global south, and I think there's literally consensus in the global south that a liberal world order never existed, let alone a rule-based one. We all know that. But I think there has been a thing after 1990. This is post Cold War that I'm talking about, where of course, you had some sort of a global economic globalization. You had a very complex, interconnected, interdependent global supply chains, etc. Right. So that's what you normally refer to as the liberal international economic order. And basically, what happened is not only it's under pressure from all the geoeconomic rivalries that we have in the realms of tech, where you have a bifurcation between a Chinese and the US led tech stock. When it comes to de-dollarization, yet to be seen if this is really happening, but there is a lot of stuff happening there. You already mentioned the supply chains, etc. So it's basically under pressure. And at the same time, the liberal hegemon, the United States, has de facto declared it obsolete. That is the political meaning of the tariff war. The liberal hegemon that spent the better of the last, not only 30, probably 50 years preaching the Washington Consensus and the benefits of a interconnected global economic order with free trade, right, has officially reversed course. No longer wants to play the role of the consumer of last resort. I think that's actually maybe the most important thing of all these technical things. The world economy in the last, I would say, half century, pretty much since the end of Bretton Woods, has run on US deficits. The world produces stuff, US consumers buy it, to simplify it to almost brutal extent. So if the US now thinks that this is no longer possible, everyone rest of us needs to think, how can we sell all these goods? And we haven't even entered the territory of discussing overcapacities, right? So the engine of the global economy is basically saying, okay, we're no longer playing this role, and we no longer want a free trade international order with all that it means, the WTO in trouble, and tariffs, wars, and leverage, and access to market, and all that. I think that is really a game changer. So what does it mean? It means that every single country, every single economy on the planet needs to rethink its economic growth model. That goes for Germany just as much as it goes for Pakistan. Obviously, our economies are different. So Germany needs to think what it can do when it can no longer be an export powerhouse, right? And of course, also when it's losing out a technological race against China. So these are the questions that Germany need to discuss. And if we had a conversation with someone in Ecuador and South Africa, they would also have to discuss it. I think for Pakistan, like so many Asian developing countries, it is important to see that de facto the most successful economic development model that ever existed, the flying geese model, is obsolete. Flying geese, if we remember, was basically starting from Japan, cheap labor, export-led growth, catch-up industrialization. It was successfully adapted by the tiger economies, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And then it was again successfully adapted as, cheap labor was going down the flying geese, right? This kind of triangle by China, by India, by Vietnam, by Thailand, etc. And now all the three pillars of the system are under enormous pressure. Cheap labor is no longer the decisive comparative advantage, or it used to be the entry tickets for developing countries. You could sell your labor cheap, and that means that some sort of an offshoring, outsourcing of production came from the industrial countries. And now basically robots, algorithms, and AI are making this, at least in the higher labor-intensive sectors, obsolete. Export-led growth is not possible in a protectionist world, where you basically have to buy an entry ticket into the markets. And catch-up industrialization is difficult when technology transfer is weaponized. If countries are friend-zoned or friend-shored out of global supply chains, and worst comes to worst, if all the overcapacities, and in your part of the world, it's mostly Chinese overcapacities, are flooding your market, which leads to actually deindustrialization. So for me, the most important point, maybe for your viewers, is that every country on the planet needs to seriously rethink the development model. It's happening, but it's very, very difficult because it's a moving target, and we don't know exactly how the new world economy is going to operate, right?
Yeah.
Shift. So your second question to the no victor part. I think if we look at, let's say, the last switch from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana, depending on where you do the cutoff point, World War I or World War II. But it was, number one, relatively peaceful between the two succeeding hegemons. Of course, there were two world wars. And there was a victor. Not so clear after World War II, because you had the Cold War and you have basically two superpowers, but certainly after 1990, right? So what the US could do, it could impose its model, which is always a reflection of its domestic values and domestic norms and institutions, onto the rest of the world. This is where the whole liberal order comes from. Multilateral governance on the global level, the UN system, an open and trade-based economic system, together with Bretton Woods in the beginning, and of course what Woodrow Wilson called making the world safe for democracy, the liberal mission of promoting democracy and human rights. The US had the power to impose that first on what it called the free world, the West, and later after 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, on pretty much everyone else. I do not think that this time we're going to have a similar situation. I do not think that, in the argument, the only candidate to be able to do that would be China, that China would be so overwhelmingly powerful, not only to be on eye level with the US, that I believe very much so, but actually to impose its system onto the rest of the world. It rather looks like we're going to go into some sort of an asymmetrical multipolarity. Without a doubt, China and the US going to be superpowers in their own league. They outmatch everyone else. But I think this narrative that is very popular in the global South right now, that there is the rise of the global South and somewhat democratization of the international order through multipolarity, it's not what I see. What I do see is that you already have the emergence of regional powers that in their own theaters matter a great deal. We only have to look at the Middle East right now. Israel and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, UAE, Qatar, and Egypt are really important factors, maybe even more important than the great powers that are far away. So they do matter in their region, but none of them has the capacity to project power on a global stage. None of them has the power to actually create the norms and rules of a world order, right? And then you have like these three, what I call continental size question marks: Russia, India, the European Union. They could become poles in their own right, But they have so many internal contradictions, from demography to technological backwardness, from political restrictions to internal crisis, and so on. That at this point, I think it's a bit too much to say that there would be poles already. They could be, they may be, but at this point, it's an open question. So that means you have this kind of a three-tier situation: two superpowers, three continental size great powers, potential great powers, and then you have lots of regional powers from Indonesia to Brazil that actually are really important regionally, but not so much globally. And that for me is an asymmetrical multipolar world. And in this mess, and I think that you pretty much can observe that in the Middle Eastern war right now, also, by the way, in the non-ability of Russia to beat Ukraine, right? So the two great powers, Russia and the US, are not able to beat a much, on paper, much more inferior opponent. I find that quite telling. So it's for me difficult to see a single victor emerging from this power struggle, rather a continuation of competition and rivalry, and all sorts of balancing that is happening. Probably going to look like way more like Europe in the 19th century, where you had five powers competing for 200 years or something. I think that's more likely than a single superpower becoming a de facto unipolar anomaly again.
Yeah, but how do you get another Metanich? And with all the social media, I recently wrote a piece in which I said, listen, if those five powers, the population had smartphones and everything was being tweeted, it was quite obvious that the concept of Europe would not have come together. But that's again a separate discussion. One other very important point that you make about the illiberal revolt, which you say is real and which clearly is real, it has strange bedfellows. You got people from the left, you got people from the right, you got big tech. So queer anarchists, you've got the degrowth activists, what you call the Catholic post-liberals, neo-reactionary monarchists, techno-libertarians. So essentially, if you look at their ideologies, there's nothing common among them. But there is one commonality. They all reject liberal, or what they call liberal hegemony. And so you say that at least in the United States, they formed a fragile, powerful alliance under Trump. And now they're dismantling universities, courts, and the administrative state. So two questions. One is this peculiar to the United States, or is the US a more extreme case of these developments that are also happening elsewhere? I mean, I can, for instance, if you look at the United Kingdom, where Starmer is literally, holding on to his position by the skin of his teeth, and has got challenges coming up from within his party, and then lots of these former Tories basically crossing over to reform UK. Similarly, AFD in Germany. The only positive development that I could say in the last couple of months is what has happened in Hungary. But give me and the viewers a sense of how you map out this illiberal revolt, and why so many disparate ideologies are coming together.
Well, now we're getting actually the very essential main thesis of the book. I set out to write a book about geopolitics, and I ended up writing a book about the twin crises of liberalism, right? I think this idea that the liberal world order is challenged, contested from outside, but dismantled from the inside. I think that for me is the main idea of the book. And the outside we already discussed. Oh, that's great competition and so on. Nothing particular new in history. The inside part, I think, is just as important. And we do see that liberal hegemony is contested in pretty much all the liberal democracies around the globe. And once these illiberal forces come to power, they are proactively starting to dismantle the liberal elements of liberal democracy. It's a little bit different from the discourse that we have, for instance, in Europe. In Europe, we would say that these right-wing populists, that's how they usually label them, or authoritarian forces are dismantling democracy. I think we should be a little bit more precise. They're not dismantling democracy per se. They actually try to speak in the name of majoritarian democracy, but they are dismantling the liberal elements, rule of law, checks and balances, minority rights, civil rights, etc. Right? That's actually what's under assault. Not so much the idea that there is elections and that the victor sets the rules. Right? So one has to be a little bit more precise there. I do in the book do a deep dive, and I'm happy that you powered through it. It's a very long and painful chapter, I have to say, to really try to sort all of these different forces that are there. There's a lot of them, as you alluded to. Some of them, as you said, actually would be normally more attributed on the progressive edge, and some of them in the traditional liberal or neoliberal center, or libertarian center, so to say. But there is also a lot of movement, a lot of new thinking, a lot of new movements on the right, right? And I think we need to understand them in order to be able to see what they're actually doing. So it's a deep dive into the US, but as you already said, I do not believe that this is an American or even only Western phenomenon. We see similar trends all over the world. I picked a few just so that I can quickly highlight that. I think the book didn't have the space to go into all of these cases. I personally reside here in Thailand, in Bangkok. Is one of the cases that's briefly discussed in a book where you have again and again and again elite interventions against liberal democracy. I discuss Israel briefly, where you have such a trend. You can even look at India, where you have this kind of Hindutva illiberal backlash against liberalism, again, not against democracy. But as you said, the pendulum swings. Nothing is set in stone. You saw that Poland, Brazil, and now Hungary have elected governments that basically want to reverse course. Hungary, I would say, let's see how that goes. But at least on paper, they want to reverse course and go back to liberal democracy. So it's not like a one-way street. What's important for me is a couple of things. Number one, it is a twin crisis of liberalism that is mutually reinforcing. What is happening on the global level is not only the dismantling of the opportunity structures for development, what we discussed. There's also, let's say, an ideological or philosophical point. The whole Fukuyama end of history stuff, right? The idea that we all eventually inevitably develop towards market economies and liberal democracies has been proven wrong. Actually, you see a global backlash against democracy. And then you have the liberal hegemon declaring the norms and values of the liberal order obsolete. So you could say the heavens are collapsing. Your utopian horizon is collapsing. And of course, that has an impact on the national reading, right? It's no longer unassailable. It becomes a normal battle between different ideologies, and not one that is basically speaking for the teleology of history and the others who are, in Germany, we say, from forever yesterday, right? No one's from forever yesterday. In the wolf world, it is an open battle, and I think that matters a great deal. On the other hand, if you look at what is happening with the world order dismantled from within, it is precisely these illiberal forces that are putting the axe not only on the liberal institutions at home, but also at the wrecking ball at the institutions on the global level. I mean, the US, as the hegemon, has withdrawn, I think, until now from 26 institutions, UN treaties, of course, the Paris Agreement, we have all noticed. I think Marco Rubio talked about 22 more that they are considering leaving. So that means there is an illiberal government in place at the very center of the liberal order, and it's dismantling it from within. So there is a mutual reinforcing cycle. And I think, and that's maybe the main message of the book at the end of the day, we can only reverse or repair this and safeguard what we need from this order if we understand what causes this illiberal revolt, why people are so angry, why are they tearing down the house, right? Because I think if you ask the liberal elites, they would say this is irrational. This has served us well. We had decades of peace and prosperity. And again, I do know that that's not the case in South Asia, but that's what the Europeans would say, right? So why are you basically destroying the house where we all live peacefully and well for decades, right? And I think that's the kind of blindness towards the mistakes that liberalism, or as I call it, really existing liberalism. You were kind enough in your introduction to say that I'm not anti-liberal. I'm absolutely not. I think that in the broad church of liberalism, I'm definitely a liberal, right? But I think what liberalism has done in the last 30 to 40 years, and in particular neoliberalism, has hurt millions of people, not only the West, but around the world. The forever wars, the automation, the globalization, the deregulation, the privatization, the oligarchization, etc. Right? There's a lot of things that liberalism really did very badly, and people are very, very angry with it. And now we have a counter revolt. Now we have an assault of illiberal forces. And I think as long as liberal elites deny this, we cannot fight.
Yeah. You see, I just, for the viewers also, I'm kind of jumping from one point to another because, frankly, every single point can be discussed for hours. But I just want to get the entire span of the book, which is why on the minus side, we are unable to discuss every single point at length. I just wanted to provide this caveat. But here's the thing: you talk about three possible orders and one realistic path. Now, I kind of chuckled because you seem to then move from your, what I would say, perhaps pessimism is not the right word, but you get what I'm trying to say, to try to inject some kind of optimism where you talk about a rules-based multipolar order with thin institutionalization, which is your preferred path, as I said in my opening. What makes you think, I mean, of course it's your preferred path, but is it also a path that you think is likely, or is it the least likely?
I'm German, as you know, and we're not very good with optimism. So the pessimism comes natural. The optimism has to be worked for. So I try to.
On that, you have to compete with the Russians, by the way, because they're really.
I wonder why, right?
Yeah.
So why I'm making this case, and I think you know that I'm a realist at heart, and I do know that it's not very likely that it's going to happen overnight. Let's say the odds are not in favor of the solution that I propose. Well, there is 2 points that actually make the case for this kind of non-hegemonic, post-liberal, rule-based, you call it international law-based, multipolar order, a thinner, let's say, a thinner, more workable, more representative version of what we had. I think, it's not entirely the Lululand. It is pretty much similar to the UN system in the Cold War. Was it working? Not really. Did some things get done? We think about the vaccines that have been developed, or the fight against the chemical gases in the atmosphere. Some things could get done, right? And there was no nuclear war, which is also not necessarily a bad thing, right? So I make two arguments. Number one, speaking as a European, but also working in Asia, in smaller Asian countries for more than 20 years, it is a necessity. If we do have no rules of the game, we have no shield against the arbitrariness of the great powers. And that's actually what the wolf world is. It's the arbitrariness, it's the extortion of the great powers. War has returned as a means of great power politics. Coercion has returned as a means of great power politics. So if we have two or three great powers, right, that means we have 200 smaller powers that are potential victims, right? So I think, number one, it's needed. For a European, it is double needed because the European Union is a very fragile, historically very odd entity that has been constructed out of treaties, right? And the acquis communautaire. So it is in itself a rule-based order that has been constructed over the US, under the US protective shield in a rule-based order. And the jury is still out if that can actually survive. Speaking as a German, that would be the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 21st century, because Europe has been a continent that was constantly at war with each other, and Germany is just sitting right in the middle of it, right? For 1,500 years. So if you take this architecture out and you take the offshore balancer out, it is very likely that these demons from history that we thought we banned forever are returning to Europe. So as a German, I have a very high stake. And as a European, I have a very high stake in safeguarding some sort of rule-based order, some sort of multilateral architecture. Why I'm slightly optimistic is, as I said, I've been working for 20 years in Asia. I'm having these discussions with pretty much everyone, every bigger country in the region. And I have not found a single one, including China, by the way, that is per se against rules and multilateral institutions. I would say it's almost a consensus that some rules are necessary and then some multilateral formats are necessary in order to be able to tackle climate change, pandemics, and all the things that we need to tackle. So that's the reason for some sort of an optimism, right? There is actually almost a global consensus that some form of thinner institutionalization would theoretically be a good thing. There are, of course, two big caveats, and that's what we need to discuss. And I think this is, also what Europe that wants to do this needs to fully comprehend, because I think that's actually one of the reasons why I wrote the book. Number one, rules are good, but the question that you're going to ask me, whose rules? Right? The rules that we had have been imposed, as I said, by the victor of the Second World War. Most of the states that exist today didn't even exist back then. They were colonies. So they did not actually subscribe to these rules. And the rules and the institutions, think about the World Bank and the IMF and whatever happened over 80 years, were not necessarily acting in their interest. Sometimes quite the opposite, right? So whose rules ask the question, okay, maybe we keep the UN system, but most certainly not in the shape of 1945. It's got to be, a reflection of the global distribution of power of 2026 forward. And that means there's going to be a much higher representation of the rising powers of the global south. And someone has to step back, and that's going to be Europe. That is politically a very difficult maneuver to say in the interest of the greater good, the enlightened interest in the greater good, because we need to safeguard that order. We have to actually curtail our influence within the institutions. I do not see the statesmen that have this kind of broad-reaching wisdom, but it's the argument that I make. And that's the easier one. The more difficult one is really about universalism. So in the global south, very, very understandably, there is as high frustration over the double standards of the West, especially of the United States, but also the Europeans, that basically for decades have disobeyed the rules that they claim have universal reach. And now you see it even peaking in the way that, a life in Ukraine and a life in Gaza have completely different meanings, right?
Yeah.
So that there is a glaring abyss of double standards. And if you are sitting in a more authoritarian country, there is a suspicion, also not entirely wrong, by the way, that a lot of these humanitarian interventions that have happened actually were targeted regime change, right?
Yeah.
So there is apprehension about these universal norms, and I understand that, and I think it needs to be taken serious. Again, I'm arguing as a German that after the civilizational breakdown, and I think that what it was in two world wars and the Holocaust, a purely positivist legal order, which means that the law only exists in what human makes out of it, is very, very open for abuse. Right? So you don't need a Hitler or Stalin or whatever in order to say the law is what I say it is, and then you start slaughtering millions, right? So I think the return to some sort of a natural law, and that in itself is a problematic idea because there's of course Christian roots and all that. But what basically the international community said after this breakdown of civilization, World War II, is to have some sort of standards that are so universally acceptable that no sovereign state can actually violate them. And that's why they've been enshrined into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and even some constitutions, etc. I do believe that this is a powerful argument that should not be thrown out of the window because of the bad behavior of the West. So how do you square that circle? Right? It's very, very difficult. I mean, universalism should not be thrown out. The child should not be thrown out with the bathwater, but at the same time, it cannot continue as it was because then you actually risk a war, and that's where I get at the Helsinki 2.0. And that's the third reason, Ejaz, for a German courageous, slightly optimistic outlook. We've done it before, right? I mean, in 1975, the self-declared communist authoritarian East and the self-declared liberal democracies came together in the Conference on Security and Cooperation of Europe and signed the Helsinki Accord, which in essence was a formula to say yes to universalism, no to interventions. And that is basically the political compromise that was more or less signing into the détente that made the Cold War much less dangerous than it was in the first 2 decades, right?
Yeah.
I think that today's positions are not entirely far off from that. If you look at, for instance, China, which is, I think, the more decisive factor here in this question, I counted in the book, I forgot the number, but I think it's more than 15, maybe 20 universal human rights declarations China has signed. Human rights are part of the Chinese constitution. They changed the constitution in order to enter human rights. So I don't think that China's position would be say, we do not accept the universality of human rights, right? Not even Russia would say that. So I don't think it's that far off. And if you look at the absolute disasters that were Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and now Iran, right? With these regime changes, neoconservative wars, I think Europe has already opted out, as you can very clearly see right now in the Persian Gulf. I think Europe is no longer willing to be the auxiliary troops for regime change operations by the US. And the US and Israel are getting a bloody nose. I think that is pretty obvious by now, right? So on the other side of the aisle, maybe this idea that you want to impose your will unilaterally everywhere is also coming down, right? So that means these two positions are not crazily far off from each other. Again, Ejaz, I'm a realist. I understand that great power rivalry is rather heating up, despite all the pictures that we saw from Beijing. It is not something that I think is going to happen tomorrow, but I think it is the job of people like us to actually think about solutions that could square this circle. So if the political will, the window of opportunity for such a grand bargain would emerge, these ideas are actually available. And that's why I ventured out on this thin trail.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'll repeat. I said this at the book launch also. So did Dr. Moeed Yusuf. That this is a very courageous attempt. And the thing is, you are presenting a macro picture. And so, if someone wants to do the micro nitpicking, there is a lot of stuff that one can nitpick. But I think that then essentially misses the essential point or various essential points in the book. So I think, for instance, I mean, purely theoretically speaking, as Moeed mentioned, that you as a realist then venture into what in a classroom setting, in a theory 101 class, would be a movement from realism to constructivism. But I think in the real world, it's essential to have that kind of movement, because the real world is not just about the IR theory 101 class. It's about trying to figure out things and trying to come up with solutions. And you're absolutely right that with the likelihood of growing conflict is going to be a phase which then will have to move things to some kind of balance. The shadow of the future kind of thing, the reputational things, middle powers understanding that in order for other middle powers to actually go by the book, they will also have to go by the book. So I think some kind of balance has to come in. And I think that is where your book makes a huge contribution. Thank you so much, Marc, for being on the program, for discussing this. And I hope that the viewers will. I just want to ask you, is there also going to be a Kindle edition of this? Because maybe those who can't get the physical copy can actually get it from Kindle or the ebooks.
I think so, yes.
Okay, great. So thanks once again. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, do comment, give suggestions. It's always great to try and figure out how the viewers respond to these episodes. Until next time, stay safe and goodbye.